Alright, I am here to talk probably way too much about a spec and how it plays, when a lot of discussion is drowned out about whether or not it should even exist. Should be fun. So, if you are here expecting me to say, delete AUG, I'm just not going to do that. And you can leave. This also isn't an attack on the devs or anything in that nature. This video will be focused on the design of AUG and how it feels to play as the Augmentation Evoker itself. And while the changes I suggest might lower its power level or affect class stacking, it is more an indirect result. I have no desire to make AUG overpowered or competitively viable, whatever that means. I've always enjoyed the idea of support classes, so I was happy to finally have one in WoW. However, Augmentation has plenty of problems with its current playstyle that becomes rather annoying rather fast in raids. Not so much in Mythic Plus. And to be really good in raids, you have to have it all planned out ahead of time, along with some luck with the right people not getting mechanics and whatnot. As such, I'm here to talk about the four main culprits of these problems. I'm not here to talk about every single talent or passive, as that would take way too long. And I would say those would generally distract from the major problems. But just before we do that, let's talk about spells that give nearby allies buffs. Blizzard of course loves the idea of you, yes, you, doing more for your friends in raid other than simply what that funny little icon by your spec tells you that you are. And as such, we have things like raid buffs, wind fury, blah 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 and whatnot. And since Shadowlands, they have tried introducing abilities such as Conqueror's Banner that gives nearby allies buffs, and those kinds of ideas have continued into a couple of talents in the rework in Dragonflight. And finally, of course, giving birth to Augmentation, and in the future hero talent surely. Direct buffs to other players, however, give a lot of power, especially in WoW's design of DPS cooldowns. A raid that can properly utilize all these buffs will exponentially excel in raids when compared to other groups. Simultaneously, however, Blizzard desires to make a game that isn't just for top players, and so along with how DPS cooldowns work in this game, Blizzard tries to rein in the amount of control or power over these buffs, and not being able to just dump these group buffs on exactly the people you want. As such, these buffs go on nearby players, can ignore party groups, and can have very little practical control depending on what the ability is. Now let's introduce to you those four culprits I talked about: Ebon Might, Prescience, Shifting Sands, and Breath of Eons. These are the four horsemen of the apocalypse of AUG Evoker's enjoyment in raid. And if I was Blizzard, these are what I would be focused on because these are the main gameplay loop, apart from maintaining Ebon Might duration, and what creates all the friction for Augmentation players. We'll ignore Breath of Eons for now and come back later, as it doesn't quite have the same problem as the other three. Essentially, Blizzard has created the worst of both worlds, which is frustrating gameplay for both camps. Mid to low Augmentation gameplay is heavily impacted by not being able to use these nearby buffs properly due to their convoluted nature, and high-end gameplay of Augmentation is impacted by having to jump through hoops trying to do what Augmentation is supposed to do. Now I'm going to ramble a little bit, and some of this will be speculation on my part. I do not know how they made Augmentation Evoker and those conversations they had while making it, but I am going to turn this into an analogy, so stay with me. I've always been curious, when Blizzard was making Ebon Might, why did Blizzard decide to make it only buff 4 people? I know part of it is probably dungeon groups and flex raids, and they might have thought Augmentation needs some skill associated with it, especially at the top end. Something for those weirdos to dig into. But if you try to make maintenance buffs complicated or forced into a spec, generally speaking you end up something annoying or clumsy gameplay-wise. Slice of Dice for rogues, the past couple expansions for Affliction trying to keep out these debuffs. You have to put on every target that aren't your dots or dots you don't care about but have to, like Siphon Life. I actually like Ebon Might a lot on the face of it. Playing well keeps up the buff, it doesn't completely make you passive, and just relying on your raid to do everything, rewards your friends with damage, and helps the raid. It is a bit binary, you either extend the duration or you're not, but you aren't also mindlessly hitting a seemingly unrelated buff every X seconds like Inquisition or something. Or Prescience, I guess. But I never really understood why it doesn't just buff every DPS in the raid, since they do have scaling tools. Not to say that doing such things would be easy to implement or balance. Mythic 20 is what they normally try to balance groups for, presumably at least, and Heroic and Under are easy content. They shouldn't be that worried about balance there, right? I mean, 10-man Heroic on launch is always pretty awful, so, you know. The gameplay of Ebon Might, and by extension Augmentation Evoker, is mainly not just about putting one strong buff like Power Infusion, but rather maintaining that buff for as long as you can. Why limit that to only 4 players? I'm not sure why the spec that is meant to buff all your friends only actually buffs your friends in your top 4 MySpace friends list. And much like a top 4 MySpace friends list, you have to constantly switch people out with 2 different abilities that you have to plan ahead of time in order to move them out, or someone else will get mad at you for not doing that. Probably more accurately, a spreadsheet gets mad at you. The spreadsheet itself. It'll talk and get mad at you. It's a real problem. For Aug. But I'm saying it's like they created the perfect spec to create friction for both the player and the raid. And now, with all that out of the way, how to change these abilities. And as a reminder, these are just my opinions. There are probably a lot of ways you can actually change these things. The core of these changes I want to make to Augmentation are mainly in Ebon Might though. Ebon Might being changed kind of has a ripple effect on how the others will feel to play. In a way, you could say Ebon Might is holding the rest of the spec hostage, but not that dramatic. Ebon Might, as mentioned, should just buff all DPS in your party raid, and I am specifying DPS here for Mythic Plus reasons. Giving primary stats to tanks and healers means more to them than just DPS. Mythic Plus, or more specifically content that scales up, one of the most important things is whether or not you can survive, and primary stats buffs to the tanks and healers make that possible in ways that other DPS cannot really provide. Augmentation already has ways that they interact with tanks and healers through talent choices, so it really doesn't need a stat buff on top of that. The stat buff can be scaled up in dungeons and down in raid. Something like Inferno's Blessing might have to be changed to something else, but that talent isn't super interesting as is, so I wouldn't mind. Moving on to Prescience then. Now if Ebon might just hit all the DPS, then I'd personally be fine with deleting this ability. On its own, it's not necessarily a bad ability, however, and without Ebon Might, you'd pretty much just be able to cast it on whoever. It's only really bad in the package deal of being able to select Ebon Might targets, like maybe if it had the priority on DPS cooldowns like the Evoker Legendary had, that could work. Maybe a little smarter than that. I've thought and read about many different ways this ability could work if Ebon Might was still buffing for people, and almost all of them have their own problems, and only really introduce a new awkward playstyle. Prescience being a beacon, for example, well, that wouldn't really change anything besides the upkeep of the buff. If you're locked moving the beacons in combat, then you would have to think about what happens when someone dies and then you wipe. You have to move things around pre-combat and then you forget, and boom, now they are on the wrong people. So in my ideal world, Ebon Might takes the hit and changes to all DPS. If Prescience absolutely had to stay even after changing Ebon Might, then I would make a small change to the talents. I would delete the crit chance, make Fate Mirror its default functionality, and then make the current 4-piece that provides a little extra damage to Eruption and extends Ebon Might into where Fate Mirror was, since that would feel more appropriate for a capstone level talent. And I like the design of playing well, rewarding you for keeping up your buffs on your raid with some extra damage for yourself. A lot of DPS players are selfish, so you should trick them into helping the raid. Shifting Sands. Why, who, and how? Like, who thought that giving a bunch of verse to a nearby player was a good thing? And there isn't actually much to say about this passive, funnily enough, but it is also one of the biggest reasons why Augment Evoker gameplay is so awkward. Because for optimal gameplay, you have to know where people are, who you should be standing next to, which is something that is really difficult to do in practice, and for some reason it's not affected by prescience in Ebon Might at all. If it was, then maybe like position-wise it wouldn't be terrible anymore. Additionally, Breath of Eons takes you away from your targets a lot of the time, since you have to move for it, but it would still be giving a very powerful stat to someone. The only way I can see this being kept as is if it was given to people with prescience and gave a completely different buff. Something that doesn't scale so ridiculously, maybe scales with crit or something. Personally, I would save the headache and delete it though, but it could work in some way. Alright, bring it back in. Breath of Eons. The thematic deep breath ability that makes you feel like a dragon. Makes it go, bleh, I'm a dragon. Horribly and terribly awkward to use in practice. And you aren't actually a dragon. In more ways than one. Breath of Eon's hitbox is actually very generous. But despite that, you'll still be playing a guessing game of, will this actually hit the boss? Then, on top of that, there's no pathing issues, a minimum range, dying to swirlies in the way, potentially to completely whiff your big CD by a variety of different and hilarious ways, line of sight issues with stairs, and possibly much more. Which is a shame, because I do love the visual of the bronze and breath going out. But maybe it should have just been a deeper circle with more of the hourglass visuals of the bronze dragons. Like maybe this could be kept if your future self flew out and did the breath for you, but maybe that'd be a little tacky. This also has the problem that it's like an extended GCD in a way that because it is flight time, the longer you're flying, the less time and be rotation. But you kind of have to. But it also could be a completely different ability entirely though. Something wacky. Like, you Spirit Bomb one of those sand orbs from Chrono Lord Deus, which would go well with Ebon Might change being every DPS, because then everyone is contributing to your Spirit Bomb. Still has the touch of Magi feel or whatever, but it would be more interesting, more flavorful, and wouldn't be so awkward to use. Anyways, onto the real problem of Breath of Eons and not the functional one. The real problem is mostly a lack of limits of caps. Either capped by how much this ability can do, how much an ally can contribute. Essentially, this ability provides too much burst for what it is, even if technically it's not that strong in the whole of your DPS. It creates a lot of problems with people that interact with haste heavily. Pretty simple, this one. And there we go. The 4 major problems with Augmentation Evoker gameplay, at least in my opinion, and how I would change the spec. Thank you for listening. Some closing thoughts. I was originally going to go into a set of secondary problems, but I believe I have made this way too long already, and the core gameplay is what I wanted to focus on. This would have included the lack of a notable difference between AoE and single target, a lack of interesting talent choices for the Augmentation Evoker's rotation, talent ideas, among other things. Those will just have to wait for a future video if I decide to make one.